Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. I'm confused, really confused. I'm having trouble understanding New York State and City's economic and fiscal situation, how we got here and how we get out. There are too many contradictory diagnoses and prescriptions out there. It reminds me of my favorite song lyric from the 60s. Something's happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. It also reminds me of Mark Twain's complaint about lies, damn lies, and statistics. To help clear up the confusion, or perhaps add to it, are two engaging practitioners of the dismal science, E.J. McMahon and James Parrott. E.J. McMahon is the director of the Empire Center for New York State Policy, a project of the Manhattan Institute. The center's focus includes the New York State and city economy, taxes and spending, healthcare and education. James Parrott is Deputy Director and Chief Economist of the Fiscal Policy Institute, which deals with economic, fiscal, and budgetary policy issues and works to increase the understanding of New York State's tax system and the adequacy of state and local public services. Welcome, E.J. Welcome, James. I've been, poring over, the stuff that you folks have written and others, and there seem to be two realities out there, two alternative universes that somehow don't come together. We have out of control spending, and then we have too little revenue. We have the millionaires running out of the state and them not running out of the state and staying because taxes don't mean that much. Is it better to raise taxes or is it better to cut services? I don't know. You guys have to help me out here. What is the situation that we're in now? Can you just briefly describe what you see as the fiscal and economic situation of New York State right now? EJ.
The fiscal and economic state of New York State right now is very troubled. Basically, what brought us here, I think I can actually phrase this in a way that James wouldn't disagree with, which is we had been, over a number of years, I think that our budgets, we're putting aside our disagreements on whether they were the right priorities or the spending levels were appropriate. We were spending at a pace that was unsustainable on our existing revenue base for the long term. Wall Street was floating our boat, and what blew up in the last year in particular on Wall Street was a way of doing business, a compensation model, an excessively overly leveraged way of doing business in the financial sector that was also the one aspect of that system was that it threw off immense amount of compensation, of bonuses and profits, all of which was taxed at the margin by the state of New York.
I think the overriding feature of the situation we're in now is a severe economic crisis, probably the worst crisis that we've had since the 1930s. New York State's lost 200,000 jobs over the past year. Fortunately, while the state budget resolution was very messy, and a lot of people are unhappy about it, fundamentally it held together a level of spending that was needed to keep the economy in New York State from getting worse. Now, I don't imagine that EJ is going to agree with that, but still I think that the alternative to slash spending would have increased job displacement and unemployment even more than what it is now.
Well, I think there's one big issue there that goes unexplored, and those who make the claim that making much deeper spending reductions would have been disruptive overlook one fact, and this is the problem at the heart of the government model in New York State and in a lot of states, not all of them. A large part of spending, not just state spending, but the local spending that the state directly or indirectly finances, is locked into paying public employees. Mm-hmm. It's locked into maintaining current staffing levels, yes, but also maintaining collective bargaining promises to increase wages and to sustain very generous benefit packages at a time when in much of the private sector you're seeing adjustments made to reflect the severe economic crisis we're in. And yes, if you had to look at the public sector in New York and view all of the collective bargaining deals as utterly inflexible and inviolate, you'd have to do some pretty disruptive things to balance the budget without big tax increases. The question is, I don't think that we ever push came to shove sufficiently to start pushing for more flexibility in those arrangements. I think they're unsustainable and that we're going to be getting there. But I think and I think that many, for instance, in the education community, were ready to deal with bigger cuts than what came down the road, which was not a cut at all, but an increase. And I think that that's part of the problem.
There's an issue that people should keep in mind, and this is something that doesn't yield to the resolution in Albany. At the heart of the economic problem, part of what's at the heart of the economic problem in this country and in this state is that we've had wages that haven't kept pace with the growth in productivity in the private sector. We need to have policies, mainly at the national level, although the state needs to support that, to raise wages so that workers don't have to rely upon mortgaging their home and taking out a second mortgage and home equity borrowing and credit card borrowing and all of that. We have a very productive economy once we get going again, but what's out of alignment is the fact that we have a serious disjuncture between productivity growth and wage growth. So that's not a direct response. It's not exactly the issue that EJ is talking about, but it's something that we need to keep in mind because we need to have a better set of policies to raise wages, and that will narrow the gap between public and private sector workers in New York.
Is that the problem in your mind?
No, I don't see how increasing state taxes by the greatest amount, I think in both nominal and relative terms in the state's history, is going to help increase private sector wages in New York. He's talking about a bigger macroeconomic issue on which we also surely disagree, but the point is that on the state level, right here in New York State, let me use one example of this, okay? Last fall, all states began to develop budget holes. Let me give you an example of the other extreme. State of Virginia, around the same time as the state of New York, the governor puts out his budget plan, his plan for closing a budget hole. The state of Virginia, which has a biennial budget, 2-year, they got a hole developing in the middle of their budget cycle. The governor says, okay, we're going to have to take a number of steps to close our budget gap here in Virginia. Now, the budget gap was smaller because they weren't as dependent on Wall Street, the revenues weren't plummeting, but they were plunging. This is happening all over. He lays out 4 or 5 things he's doing, and he ticks off 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 is, state employees were supposed to get a 2.5% pay increase at the end of the year. That's not going to happen. Period. It's not happening. Why? State of Virginia doesn't have a Taylor law. In the state of Virginia, it's actually against the law to collectively bargain with public employees. Is that a law that dates back to the 1930s or 20s? No. It was signed by Doug Wilder in 1994. Okay? So that's a different political tradition. That's the competition also, by the way, among them. So in New York State, here's what the situation is. You've got 140,000 state employees who are due to get in April and are now getting a 3% pay increase. Okay, in the midst of the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. David Patterson puts out his plan the same time last year and begins to suggest that, I need to go back to the unions and ask them to talk about a pay freeze and some other things to hold down our costs. Has it happened? No. Belatedly, and I think he's got his timing all wrong, the governor decided he needed to make a serious threat of layoffs to get their attention. And their response is basically to figuratively give him the finger. Something may or may not happen on that front. Eventually, push is going to have to come to shove. As I said, I think they're going to have to give something. But the point is, we're in many cases, this goes down to the local level also. We're locked into these inflexible labor agreements. The unions don't show any give. They scream, it's got to be, spread the pain, it's got to be fair. They promoted the agenda to raise taxes and won a good part of their tax agenda. And now that they've gotten it, they're still not giving.
It would be hard to understand, given what EJ just said, that in this state, if you look at where the income growth has taken place since 2002, 2003, between those years and 2009, all of the income growth went to the top 5% in New York State. In EJ's world, it seems as if all of the income growth has gone to public sector workers. Therefore, we need to cut back in that area. I think if we look at the totality of this picture, in New York, we have to understand that there's been a lot of economic growth, and it's all accrued to the people at the top. And I think what was very positive about the budget resolution this year was that we asked the high-income people who have benefited from that sort of economic growth to pay a little bit more than what they've been paying in recent years.
Wait a minute, a little bit more?
A little bit more.
Go ahead.
In the scheme
a little
of things,
bit more?
A little bit more in relation to the income growth that was received.
31 to 40% more. Do you know what the marginal rate's going to be for some people here in the bubble they created? Because our tax code is a mess. It's a disgrace, okay? Some people will be paying a 20% marginal tax rate as part of this plan. A little bit more. There'll be no itemized deductions whatsoever for people making over $1 million. You'll have only half of them, as you always had if you make over $500,000. And there's a 31% rate increase. You don't have full deductibility in the federal level.
31% percentage of what?
31%. Whatever you were paying, for every $100 you were paying before, you're going to pay $131. A third more. That's not a little bit more. That's a lot more.
But if your income has gone up by 100% in the last 5 years, what's so bad about paying a little bit more in personal income tax?
Well, first, again, I question whether a third more is A, little bit more. B, those
You're
people
just talking about the income tax side. EJ, income taxes in New York State are only about 25% of all state and local taxes. What about the sales tax at a state and local level? What about the property tax?
The state gets 60% of its tax revenue, more than any other state with the exception of Oregon. 60% of New York State's tax revenue comes from its income tax. 41% of the income tax in 2007 was paid by the highest earning 1% of New Yorkers.
So that's a quarter.
Which means that when you put that together with the entire tax burden in New York State, is that overall we have a regressive tax burden, so that EJ's top 1% that's paying 41% of the income tax is paying a lower share of their total income in state and local taxes than somebody who's
disagree.
making $50,000.
Oh, okay. Now wait a minute.
That's not true.
Wait a minute. We got to make this clear to me, let alone to the people watching here. Let me summarize what I think that you're saying here, James, is that what EJ is looking at is income tax, and what you're saying is
only
if you
a small part of the overall tax.
And when you look at other taxes like the sales and the property tax, which are regressive taxes, you're saying that the aggregate tax burden is regressive, and the new tax formula with the personal income tax increase makes it more progressive.
Makes it more progressive, but it hasn't balanced it out yet. It's still on the whole regressive, and people in the middle are paying more than they should. People at the bottom are paying more than they should, and I would say people at the top could probably bear a little bit more.
Our tax code is the most friendly in the region to people at the bottom. Single mother, 2 kids, $16,000 a year in income. Okay, she gets $8 an hour, $8.50 an hour. Okay, classic image of a low-wage worker in New York. Okay, what does she pay in taxes? Let's start with the income tax. Okay, what does she pay in taxes? She pays nothing.
You got me.
She gets back about $1,500, $1,700. Okay, which is enough to offset any reasonable assumption of what she pays in sales tax alone. Okay,
and she's probably paying something in property tax. In her, she probably
property tax in New York City.
She's paying something in. Yes, in rental buildings, yes.
Okay, well then if we're going to start talking about, first of all, what according to your own model that you cite, which is partially broken, which is that income distribution piece that the Center for Budget Policy Priorities puts out.
Why if you impute partially, it's not as up to date as we would like it to be, but it's not broken.
It did not adequately show what a low-income person is not paying in taxes. It made the basic mistake. We'll get into the wonky side of it. It misunderstood.
What do you mean, get into the wonky? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Basically, that if you look at that, what it does is it takes income quintiles, and one way it figures out how much people pay in taxes is use consumption profiles from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. You know what the problem is with that? Okay, this is a federal statistics. Federal statistics measure what people consume as well and compared to what they earn. The problem is that for people in the lowest quintile, what they consume is twice what they report earning. Now, if you believe that they earn half of what they consume, then you end up with a tax burden, an effective tax burden that's twice what it actually is, which is what this survey calculated. We have the nation's second most generous earned income credit for working poor, which is appropriate. It's a good thing.
Right. Okay, now if
we agree on that.
We agree.
That's a policy we've always agreed on.
I don't have
thing.
an idea of what you just agreed on. But okay, now wait a minute.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the poorer elements, the less wealthy elements, are in a sense not very highly taxed, and you're saying that the wealthy are not as taxed as they ought to be. So am I to assume that you might agree that the burden of taxation really falls most heavily and perhaps disproportionately on the middle class?
If we were not so heavily reliant on high-income taxpayers, by the way, I don't disagree the middle class is overtaxed in New York. Nothing he's proposing actually helps them. But
we've actually proposed a circuit breaker.
He's proposed a higher income tax rates to redistribute to them, but that's another issue.
Well, that would address both of them.
Right. So we can go from a nearly 9% rate to a 15% rate.
No, wait a minute. Wait, stop for a second.
And the rich people would still want to live in New York because it's so productive to be here. It's so desirable.
Wait a minute. No, okay, respond to that. If you raise it marginally, really, the studies seem to suggest, again, data, the Princeton study in New Jersey,
the Princeton study did not show that. Do you know what the Princeton study shows?
It showed that there were more multimillionaires after the introduction of the tax than before.
It showed that during a boom centered on Wall Street, where most high-income New Jersey residents worked, that the number of New Jersey households earning high income subject to their new higher income tax grew significantly more slowly than the U.S. norm. They've got 4,300 missing $500,000 a year families. That's what the Princeton study shows.
Only because states like New York and New Jersey are mature states that aren't growing as rapidly in population terms.
Baloney. They were adding those right up to the point where they raised taxes.
No, wait, before we
it didn't show that rich people left New Jersey because the taxes went up.
It did show an increase in migration out of New Jersey.
But did it show an in-migration of rich people as well?
It showed a mix. The point is, obviously,
they came to New York, where the tax rates were lower.
This basically...
Is this a real argument? If you raise,
it absolutely is a real argument. Let me choose an issue that he sounded off on.
Where are they going to move to?
Wait a minute. What's an issue here's an issue where everybody who vote... This Kansas stuff.
Okay, I'm sorry. Nebraska.
Oh, come on.
South Dakota. Where are they going to move? Virginia?
Florida,
Delaware?
New Hampshire, Connecticut, where the rate is about half of what ours is now.
Why
do you think all the hedge funds are in Connecticut anyway?
Why didn't you move? You're a millionaire.
Actually, in a study that we did last year, in the course of that, we happened to look at the Forbes list of the 400 wealthiest Americans. There were something like 34 hedge fund operators who lived in the tri-state area. 29 of them, tri-state area, including Connecticut, 29 of them lived in New York State. 27 of them lived in New York City, where ostensibly the marginal tax rate was higher, much higher than in Connecticut or New Jersey. The
states that impose high marginal income tax rate, it's been true for decades, have grown more slowly than states that don't. Now, if taxes were the only factor, this is a straw man. This whole argument is a straw man. The straw man is taxes are is to invent the straw man that I'm somehow suggesting that taxes are the only thing that matter, and that if you increase tax rates, everybody subject to it will leave. That's obviously not true.
Right.
I would never say that.
Right.
If that was true, this place would have been empty. That Park Avenue in the Upper East and West Side would have emptied out around 1977 when a place was a hellhole and taxes were nearly 20% in New York City. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is ultimately you will grow more slowly, your economy will be less dynamic, you will fall behind further and further and further. That's what happened in the past. That's what's going to happen again now. Now, I'll tell you what.
I take exception to that.
Go ahead.
I don't agree with the premise of that we're going to grow more slowly because we have higher taxes. And and I don't think that, there's a study that the Citizens Budget Commission did which looked at business taxation in upstate New York, downstate New York, relative to 6 or 7 other, quote, competitive states, and found that upstate New York had the lowest business tax burden among any of those 7 or 8 areas.
But that's not what we're not talking about upstate New York business taxation. We're talking about the income tax in New York State. And we're talking about, particularly in this audience, we're talking about New York City. I'll bet you people can DVR this or whatever, come back in a few years, and let's see if we're all saying that was really successful. That tax increase worked out really well. It had no negative impact.
Okay.
My answer is, and we can differ, maybe we can even make a little bet on it. My answer is people will be seeing that there were negative effects.
I'll hold the money.
Okay, go ahead. Okay. But I think it's going to have a negative impact.
Okay. James, you wrote a piece for the Fiscal Policy Institute titled "The Economic Crisis is Historic as well as a Terrible Thing to Waste." I think both of you agree that this crisis would be a terrible thing to waste. How would you not waste this crisis?
I think the problem is, and we've begun to see the waste of it already, is to bring bring our expenditures in line with the economic reality. And we were spending more really on a recurring basis than we could afford for years before this. And the first person to use that phrase repeatedly was Eliot Spitzer in running for governor in 2006, which led some people like me to believe, falsely, that what he meant to do was, if necessary, invent a crisis in order to bring spending back into levels that we could afford.
He invented a crisis, but
he invented a different kind of crisis for himself.
Right.
But I think that the fiscal crisis we've had and that we're having, and the economic crisis that's going to continue here in New York State in particular, is something that is an opportunity. Is an attention-getting event, obviously, and it is an opportunity to address some issues about the cost of government that nobody's been willing to address when the money was rolling in and nobody had to be fiscally disciplined.
Okay, how would you not waste this crisis?
Well, what I was getting at was mainly the economic crisis, and I think three things need to happen in response to this economic crisis, and then if we do that, then we certainly won't be wasting it. One is that we need to get away from an economic model that relies so heavily upon debt, and we need to focus more on investment, and investment in the right way. And I'm not talking about reducing marginal tax rates on high-income people because they're going to save more, and they're going to, quote, invest that in the financial market. I'm talking about investment in expanding the productive capacity of the economy, in infrastructure, in human capital.
Okay.
Secondly, we need to realign wages and productivity, as I talked about before. Mm-hmm. And third, I think we need to restore a more appropriate role for the financial sector in the economy. In recent years, the finance sector grew from 10% of the economy in the early 1970s to 40% of the economy in 2007. I think we need to get back a lot closer to 10%. I'm not hopeful at this point that that's going to happen, but clearly it's harmful to the broader economy in this state, country, world.
You're talking about the national economy as well.
Yeah, to have a finance sector that is basically highly leveraged and speculating and doing a lot of financial engineering and innovation that's counterproductive and brought down this economy in the way that it
I don't
has.
entirely disagree
No,
with everything
I
you
would
said
say
about
not. What replaces, though, the financial sector as a driver of economic wealth?
I mean, that's a question I think that I would challenge James to answer in this respect. I think that there's a lot of arguments can be made about why New York City has got some unique, innate comparative advantages that should allow it to evolve out of the problem that we're in, that we're actually better situated in certain ways to come out of the economic crisis and to remake the city as a strong thing and than other cities are.
Right.
However, the problem is, I think that one issue about high marginal tax rates, and remember, it's a combination, it's just those high marginal rates, which in the city is going to be 12.5%, 12.6%. Very, very high business corporate profits taxes, the highest in the country by double the average. Very high taxes on partnership, professional income, just a whole high array of costs that pay for government services. The financial sector, as it evolved over the last 25 years with that fabulous wealth, I would argue to a certain extent, and I've said this before and before this crisis, was kind of a tax-tolerant sector also. There were very strong advantages to being located in New York in that business, in the very high margin, highly profitable, fantastically, in the literal sense of the word, fantasy, profitable business. And it was, and I think a lot of players and actors in that business are more tolerant of higher rates than people in other businesses are, especially other fields that are less profitable, have lower margins, and that can also be done profitably in other places. And I think that we've hurt ourselves, that we hurt ourselves if we think we can tax with impunity because it's New York and where else are they going to go? There's plenty of other places to go.
But that's not quite what you're saying.
No, well, there's the economic side. And the economic side, I think, I agree that New York has many innate advantages. We have several other strong sectors in the economy. We're not a one-horse town. As much as we have been reliant on Wall Street for revenues, there are many parts of the city economy that are very productive and will be competitive and will continue to be a magnet for highly innovative and creative people from all over the United States and all over the world. So that's our underlying strength. The quality of life here is much better than it has been in the past. There's a higher premium placed today on large, densely settled urban cities in a resource-constrained world. So I think that's going to contribute to New York's comparative advantage going forward. And to the extent that the tax burden is an issue for small and medium-sized businesses, I think in addition to having a more efficient public sector at all levels of government, I think we need to put greater reliance on a personal income tax as a way to fund necessary government infrastructure and public services.
You've said that Wall Street is not just down, it's out, that Wall Street as we know it will no longer exist. What does Wall Street look like in 5 years, and what provides the engine for growth?
Well, it's less heavily, it's not, and of course it's not going to disappear physically.
Right.
It is what's disappeared and what's going to reappear is what's already beginning to replace it is something that's less heavily leveraged, more risk averse, more heavily regulated by the federal government. I mean, the last remaining investment banks are now bank holding companies. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a more staid place than it was. Less freewheeling, less reckless, in all the ways that also made it, we're spinning off money faster than anybody could count it in the past.
How do you make up that money?
How do you make up that money in New York?
Yep.
Well, I think we need to have, in part, we need to restructure the state-federal fiscal relation. I think we've gone in the wrong direction on the federal tax side. Maybe we'll make up some lost ground, reverse some of the bad things that have been done at that level. And I think over time that New York's economy, when there is a recovery, will flourish, and I expect New York to share every bit in the recovery that takes place. Contrary to what some people think, that we're going to lag exiting this downturn.
Okay, that leads me to my last questions. We've got 30 seconds left. Look in your crystal ball. I know it's pretty tough. Look 6, 8, 9 months or a year down the road. What do you see happening? What's going on?
In Albany, with the state and the city?
Yeah.
Things have just about hit bottom by then in terms of counting revenues. Maybe economically it's hit bottom if you measure the economic decline in terms of employment and other issues. But we haven't seen the worst of the fiscal problems the state and city are going to have.
Okay.
I think we'll have an even more severe recession than what we have now. Unemployment could be 10% in the city at that point. And it probably will be at the national level too. Again, in this downturn, I don't think we're going to be worse off than around the country. And fortunately, to help us address our budget gap again next year, we will have another installment of the state fiscal relief out of the federal stimulus package. So that will make a big difference.
Sort of a yes or no. Is there the political will to address what you see down the line?
No. Presently, no.
At the national level, I think there is, and I think at the state level, I think we have to find our way.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.